It's Nerina time. It is so wonderful to have one of our absolute favorite persons in the world, both in terms of financially and personally, and someone who's been such a big feature and such an important part of the wealth chef world and the wealth builders, from speaking on the stage at live events when we still used to have in-person events, to creating and co-creating programs. And so it is my absolute privilege and pleasure to welcome the amazing Nerina Visser back in the Wealth Builder House. And today's session is all about understanding living annuities specifically. We had a fantastic session. Wow, time passed, but it was understanding the pension system, retirement funding in South Africa, and came to the two-pot system. And so those recording, that information is there. Now, if you're not in South Africa, it's not a problem, because the concepts of drawdown or living annuity, so living annuities aren't, it's not the same name elsewhere, but we're talking about feeding off your retirement investments. Now, obviously, there are things that are very specific to the legislation in the country that you operate in that governs that. But I'm sure Nerina's deep wisdom will also cover broader principles. So I'm going to hand it over to our amazing Nerina.
First and foremost, hello everybody. It is so wonderful to be in this community. I don't even want to say back in this community, because it feels like I'm always in this community. It's like being part of a family. You're not always necessarily physically in the same room or in the same space, but you're still part of the family. So it is wonderful to be here with you all today. Thank you for this opportunity. And yes, I'm so pleased that you mentioned the broader concept of living off your investments. I call it the feasting phase. And so I am certainly going to be talking more broadly in terms of, yes, what can be done under a living annuity, but also how should we think in terms of the living annuity or that type of asset pot as part of our bigger asset base, and how we actually draw our regular income from that. So let's get straight into this, because when we are on our wealth building journey, whether it's with Anne or without Anne, you are all with Anne, like me as well, we go through a period of an accumulation phase where we are building up assets towards that financial freedom number, that day that we have an asset pot that is big enough to support our income needs, whatever they might be. But one of the aspects of the accumulation phase is that we don't just focus on accumulating assets wildly, but very specifically in which pots do we actually accumulate that wealth. Because not only does it offer us different types of benefits during the accumulation phase, but ultimately when we start feasting off our assets, they have very specific pros and cons in each of these. And we often refer to those three major pots as the tax deferred, the tax exempt, and the taxable pot. So the tax deferred certainly would be your retirement savings. And as the name suggests, you're deferring the payment of the tax until a later day. And then, of course, there's the tax exempt and the taxable. And we today want to focus on that tax deferred pot that you've now accumulated. And now you reach the point where you can now actually start feasting off your pot. Whether you are at the age that legislation allows you to access that particular pot might be a constraint. If you've been on a very strong and very successful wealth accumulation journey, maybe you reach that point before the laws in the country allows you to access that pot. But I'm going to, for the purposes today, assume that we are at the stage in life where we are legally actually allowed to start feasting off the tax deferred pot as well. In South Africa, that's the age of 55. So what I've done, and by the way, I will be sharing the slide deck with you afterwards. I know there's a lot of words and a lot of information, but I thought, let me put it together for you in the slide deck, and you can then engage with this at your own time. So I'm going to be circulating this. I'm going to be sharing this with you, but I wanted to start off by just within the tax deferred bucket, we effectively have two components. There's the pre-retirement and the post-retirement component. Now, the pre-retirement, we typically would be looking in terms of a retirement annuity, but this could also be a pension fund, a provident fund, might even be a preservation fund, any form of pre-retirement savings. The post-retirement, there are also various options. We're going to be focusing today specifically on living annuities, but I will also just touch on some of the alternatives that are available within this space. So what is it, the difference really? So pre-retirement, the retirement annuity, as it suggests, that's something where you are still contributing to, you're putting money in, you are basically accumulating, you're building up that pot. Whereas the living annuity is post-retirement. You have now retired from that retirement annuity and you now start drawing a regular income from that. The numbers that I quote there, South African legislation, you have to draw something between 2.5% and 17.5% of your capital every year. And you can choose at what frequency, whether it's monthly or annually or whatever the case might be. Who can have these types of investments? Both pre and post-retirement is only available to individuals. This is a tax-deferred tax opportunity that is available to an individual. This is not something that you can do in the name of an entity or in the name of a trust or whatever. And yes, the entity or the trust can make contributions and you could even receive some of the benefits in a trust, but the account holder, if I can put it that, the annuity holder will necessarily be an individual. Really important aspect of a living annuity. The only way that you can get money into a living annuity is from retirement savings. You can't make a cash deposit into a living annuity. You can't accumulate 5 million rand and say, well, I'm just going to now put this in buy a living annuity. You can't go directly into a living annuity. It has to come through the conduit of pre-retirement savings. And that's why these two sit quite nicely side by side. I'm not going to talk about how one could possibly still get a fairly big amount of money into a living annuity. Suffice to say for now, it has to come from existing pre-retirement savings of whatever form. That could also come from your pension or provident funded work. It could be from a preservation fund that you've had from years gone by. That's how you get into a living annuity. What about withdrawals? Because now we're talking about feasting. And so very importantly, in a retirement annuity, for all intents and purposes, you cannot access that money until the age of 55. Small exceptions, if the amount is less than 15,000 Rand, you're allowed to withdraw it. Really, I almost want to say, why bother? The other aspect is that nowadays, and we did do a session last year on the two-pot system, yes, there is now the savings component of your retirement annuity fund, which you are allowed to access before the age of 55, but you're taxed at your personal income tax rate. Definitely not worth it. Don't even think about it. So as far as we are concerned, you can't withdraw from a retirement annuity until the age of 55. If that retirement annuity is less than 247,500 Rand, you're allowed to take the full amount. If it's more than that, you're only allowed to take up to 1/3, and the other 2/3 or the remainder then has to move to an annuity. Living annuity is what we're going to be talking about today, but it could also go to a guaranteed or a life annuity or whatever. But part of the legislation in South Africa is now this forced annuitization, meaning that at least 2/3 of your pre-retirement savings has to be used to buy you an income for life, which is what the annuity is really all about. As far as the living annuity is concerned, you can only withdraw the full amount in your living annuity if the market value is less than 125,000 Rand. And such a withdrawal, any withdrawals from a living annuity is subject to personal income tax. So whether this is at the point where you've got that smaller amount and you're taking the full amount, or whether it is your regular ongoing withdrawals that you do, it's all subject to personal income tax. What about transferring between different funds? We know that on the RA side, yes, there is a Section 14 transfer process, so one can transfer from one provider to another. And quite interesting is that our regulator allows up to 6 months for such a process to be, it can take as long as that. And unfortunately, there are some providers that tend to use 5 months and 28 days before they finalize it. Whereas if we're looking at a living annuity, you can also transfer that from one provider to another. It's a Directive 135 transfer process. And interestingly enough, this process is typically a lot faster. often only takes about 6 to 8 weeks to finalize, and we've certainly seen it happen quicker than that also. So you can transfer a living annuity from one provider to another. What about, let's call it the retirement age? Now, as I said, in the pre-retirement side, you can't really do anything until the age of 55, but you are not forced to retire when you reach 55. This is something which is available to you anytime after the age of 55, which is quite useful when we start thinking in terms of retiring from pre-retirement savings to post-retirement, like a living annuity, because unlike old school insurance-based retirement annuities where you often had a specified retirement date, in a modern day retirement annuity fund, it's your personalized RA. You choose when you want to retire from that fund. The living annuity also is a post-retirement product, so there's no expiry date on that. You can keep that and have that until the money runs out, or until you die, or until you transfer it out. So, no.
Sorry, just in terms of the retirement age, in the UK,
Yes.
on SIPs, so SIPs are just the, self-invested personal pension. I think there's a percentage of a SIP that at a certain age, I think it's about 75 or something, has to start being drawn down. So in South Africa, you can literally leave an RA, and
for the rest of your life.
Obviously, when you die, that just becomes part of your estate and is bequeathed.
No, it does not become part of your estate. We're going to come to
It
what happens at death.
It goes to the beneficiaries. Thank you for correcting that. It goes to your beneficiaries that are specified.
Exactly, yes. But under South African legislation, there are no specifications of you having to retire at a certain age or a certain date. It's up to you as the individual. You just can't do it before the age of 55. That's the only sort of age limit in terms of that. So what are your income options really from this living annuity? So obviously on the RA side, it's pre-retirement, you can't exit, there's no income option available. On the living annuity, as I've mentioned, that drawdown rate has to be at least 2.5% of the capital every year. It's not allowed to be more than 17.5% of the capital every year. And you choose the frequency at which you want this payment to be made to you, monthly. Annual is the two most common ones. Monthly for people that are really looking to draw a regular income from their living annuity. Annual for people who are in the living annuity, let's call it for other reasons, but don't necessarily need that income on a month-to-month basis. And then an annual payment is actually quite useful. But you can go for quarterly or half-yearly also if you want to. And both this rate of drawdown and the frequency at which it's done is something which you review and are allowed to change every year on the anniversary date of the living annuity. And we're going to come to the benefit of this flexibility compared to something like a life or a guaranteed annuity where you don't have these options to change things in future. So that's an annual event. What are the tax implications? Now, a very important concept for both retirement and living annuities, pre and post-retirement, is this beautiful benefit that inside these annuities, inside these funds, there's no tax. There's no tax on the income earned, whether that's interest or whether it's dividends, no tax payable. Whether it's capital gains that is realized, no tax payable inside it, which is why this gets referred to as a tax-deferred pot. You only pay tax on this once you start drawing from this, as in the case of the living annuity, whatever the rand amount is of that drawdown rate that you choose, you will be taxed on that. And I've given you there an indication of what is the tax threshold based on your age. So if you are under 65 years old, you only start paying income tax when your annual taxable income exceeds 95,750 rand. Call it 8,000 rand a month. So that gives you some sort of idea of the amount of regular monthly income that you can earn without paying any tax on it whatsoever. As you get older, more tax benefits kicks in, and that amount does increase to some extent. Now, the tax on your living annuity is very much like a PAYE on a salary that you would earn. The administrator of the living annuity will be administering that. They will be withholding that tax before they even make the payment to you, pay it directly across to SARS, and once a year you will get your IRP5 tax confirmation, tax return confirmation that says this individual has already paid this amount of tax on this amount of income. So you can think of it really much like it works with your regular salary that you might be earning in terms of that. So what about then when we get to death? So let's compare these two, because there's quite a big difference between the processes. What they have in common is that in both cases, these fall outside of your estate. Now, the benefit of that is that not only are there no estate duties payable on it, there's no executor's fees that is payable on that, and the process is run completely independently from the winding up of your estate. So it is a really useful mechanism to ensure that there's continuity in income available to your beneficiaries. And that's the beauty of the living annuity. Let's start with that one, because what's quite interesting about the living annuity also is that the only person who determines who the beneficiaries on a living annuity is you, the annuity holder. You decide, who do you want your money to go to? It can be one individual, it can be 20 if you want to, it can be an entity, you can leave your money to the SPCA if you want to, whatever you want to. You determine, you specify it, and it will necessarily be paid out like that. Contrast that to pre-retirement savings. If you die and you still have a retirement annuity fund, because this falls under a different set of legislation than the living annuity, there's a board of trustees that has the fiduciary responsibility to ensure that they must first check whether there was nobody that is dependent on you. Different between dependency and beneficiary. You can define who you want to be the beneficiary. But if there's somebody that is dependent on you, the trustees will give precedence to the dependents. And because they need to first ascertain who that is, typically we find that the process of actually paying out the proceeds of a retirement annuity often takes a lot longer than for a living annuity. For example, even if you have no dependents and you've defined your beneficiaries, if there's no dependents, the fiduciaries or the trustees still are not allowed to pay out that money for at least 12 months after your death, because they need to allow sufficient time for anyone to come forward and say, actually, I was dependent on this individual. So when we start thinking in terms of having retirement annuities still later in our life, it is useful to just remember that the process around the after death of your retirement annuity is quite a bit more onerous and takes quite a bit longer than in the case of a living annuity. The other thing that's also important to know with a living annuity is if you have multiple beneficiaries that you've nominated, each beneficiary can, independently of the others, decide how they want to receive their portion of your living annuity. For example, they can choose to continue receiving a regular income, not the income that you received, the income that they choose to receive, and they will be taxed on that income in their personal capacity. So let's think of a situation. You might be 60-year-old individual who's got quite a nice big living annuity, and you're earning quite an income from that in your personal capacity. You're still paying quite a bit of tax on that. One of your beneficiaries may be a younger child, might even be your grandchild who is not earning a taxable income yet. They can choose to draw their income from the portion of the living annuity that they inherit, and the tax that they will be paying will be a lot less than the tax that you were paying on it when you were getting that income from the living annuity. So that process post death is really one of the best ways to help with your estate planning, the tax liabilities around it also, but really ensuring the longevity and the continuity of the benefit to your beneficiaries as you determine it. By the way, you don't have to specify this in your will. It doesn't have to be part of your will to say this is because it's determined by your nominated beneficiaries as you have it for the living annuity. Also important to just highlight the two different types of legislation that governs pre-retirement and post-retirement investments. Pre-retirement falls under the Pensions Fund Act, and so you might often have heard about Regulation 28 in South Africa, which is the regulation that governs what are the allowable underlying investments in a retirement fund, including a retirement annuity. And probably the one that most people often refer to is how much of my money am I allowed to invest offshore? That we know increased about 2 years ago to 45%. I'm old enough to remember the days when it was only 15%, and it went from 15 to 20 to 25 to 30, and now we are at 45%. The other restriction, interestingly enough, under Regulation 28, is that you cannot have all of your investments in what we would call growth assets. You are limited in amount of equities that you can have in such a portfolio and the property that you can have in such a portfolio. So it means that typically you would have at least some portion of your pre-retirement savings in interest-bearing or income assets. The living annuity falls under the Long-Term Insurance Act. It says, do whatever you want to, invest where you want to, in South Africa, offshore, in high-risk equities, in very low-risk money market, whatever you want to do. I always find this quite ironic and quite bizarre to think that, you know, when you're a relatively young person still building up towards your wealth accumulation pot in your retirement annuity, you should be careful, don't take too much risk. Once you retire and you're now sort of living off it, I don't care what you do whatever you want to. You'd think that the regulation would be the other way around, but it isn't. So one of the reasons why people do move from a retirement annuity to a living annuity before they actually necessarily need to earn a regular income from that living annuity is to move away from the act, the legislation, the regulation under which pre-retirement savings are managed to the less onerous sort of requirements of the post-retirement. And that's why I also highlighted the difference in terms of how it's dealt with upon your death. So one does not have to wait until you need to earn an income from your tax-deferred pot before you retire to a living annuity. You can choose to do so earlier. I can tell you that as I sit here, almost 61 years old, at the age of 55, I retired from all of my retirement, pre-retirement savings into a living annuity. I'm still very much working, earning an active income, paying tax on that, but I draw my 2.5% minimum on an annual basis from my living annuity because the bulk of my tax-deferred pot now sits in an environment that looks quite different than what I would have been allowed to do with that money when it was in pre-retirement savings. I also know for my beneficiaries, the process on my death is going to be a lot more simple and straightforward. And yet I've retained all of the tax benefits of the tax-free growth. I've retained the benefit that it's not in my estate. The only tax implication is the tax that I have to pay on that 2.5% of income that I draw once a year. But the other 97.5% remains invested for a very long term. And we're going to talk about sort of investment strategies around this also. But it remains invested for the long term. And for me personally, that was a very elegant way of managing on an ongoing basis this big part of my overall asset base, my tax-deferred pot. So before I move on sort of from the technicalities and start talking about maybe, okay, now we want to start feasting. How are we going to do this? Are there any questions or comments even at this time?
You get reminded and on the anniversary date that you can change your frequency.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's quite a formal process on our side, is that as soon as the month end has sort of passed, because what you are, the rand amount of what you will be taking depends on the capital, the size of the investment, the living annuity pot, as at the month end date. So very early in the new month, you will get your anniversary reminder with some sort of proposals, almost in terms of, or telling you what are your options, what do you propose? Are you comfortable just making your own choices from here on? Do you need to speak to either your dedicated financial advisor or to someone else here at ETFSA? But yes, that is an annual reminder process that you automatically will receive from us.
Thank you so much.
I see Kerry also has her hand up.
Hi, Nerina. It's good to see you again.
Great stuff.
I might be jumping the gun. I have a question. If we're worried about the performance and fees of an existing living annuity, is it worth moving it?
The easy answer is yes, it's absolutely worth it, especially if one is still thinking in terms of a relatively long time horizon, as would be the case. We so often speak about compound and how compound interest, earning compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. Paying compound interest or fees is one of the worst destructions that you can get. So I encourage people also to think in terms of not just the once-off annual fee that it might be now, but to appreciate that this is a fee that will accumulate over time and compound. So when I talk about the different sort of drawdown strategies, I will mention that again, but costs, as always, it's probably even more important in your feasting sort of phase, because everything that the costs literally sort of take away from your future income. This is not just reducing the growth potential. It's literally actually paying part of your income to a provider. So yeah, I would think that it is absolutely worthwhile.
Yeah, because Mom's is with the people that sound like a Land Rover. And I got all my RAs away from them because the fees are ridiculous. And I'm pretty sure the performance of hers is shocking. And we got to break up with the financial advisor on that side. But it really is, it's not a huge pot, but I'm pretty sure it should be doing far better and costing much less than, they're usually about what, 4%.
It's not surprising to see that. We often see, especially with living annuities, bizarrely, and what I find quite unusual almost, is to see relatively high advisor fees on living annuities, which I also don't quite see how that is justified. So yes, I think the other benefit or advantage of moving a living annuity compared to when you are looking to move pre-retirement savings, on a living annuity, there's no penalties. There might be a small admin charge. On pre-retirement savings, especially when you are moving an old school insurance-based RA, you do find that there could be penalties and there could be, sort of costs associated with that move, but not in the case of a living annuity. So for me, a living annuity that is unnecessarily expensive for me is a bit of a no-brainer to just move it to a more efficient and lower cost option, certainly.
Yeah, I just want to second the saying thank you to Susan from you guys. She's been fantastic. She's answered all my questions and she was very helpful when I moved my one RA to you guys. So please let her know we do appreciate you guys.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. Yeah, Susan is one of our registered advisors. She's also a certified financial planner, and she really is our retirement specialist. I can tell you that when I put together the slide deck for this, I was like, Susie, come check, help. So yeah, thank you very much for that feedback, Kerry. I will certainly pass on the message. Cool. Renee. Is that the correct pronunciation? Is that the right pronunciation of your name?
Yes, spot on. Thank you. So I inherited 50% of a living annuity 5 years ago. So it's with Glacier, and you just sign the papers because you're traumatized, and then you realize, okay, you're sitting with this thing, and what they told me is you can't do anything with this now. So I checked my fees now, I'm doing my own homework. So then, but I actually called this guy who takes his, percentage for, giving me a birthday call once a year. But it is like, according to him, I can't do anything. I mean, I guess except move it to another company. But so do I have to wait until I'm 55 before I can add any amount, do anything with this? This just sits there and the drawdown is 2.5% per year.
Okay, so a couple of sort of questions in that. The first thing is, can you do anything with it? Yes, there's certainly, in a living annuity, there's certainly two things that you can do. The one is that you can move it. The second thing is that you can change the underlying investment exposure. Don't let him tell you that you can't make changes to the underlying. You absolutely can make changes to that. But the second question that you asked about adding to it, no, you can't add to it because, as I said, you can't just put in money into a living annuity. It can only come from pre-retirement savings, and for as long as you are younger than 55, you would not have the ability to transfer pre-retirement savings to this. So I think it certainly would be in your best interest to look at moving this, continue with the 2.5% annual withdrawal, and once you reach the age of 55, then one can assess and decide, is this a good time to actually add other retirement savings to it, or do you just continue with that as it is? So, yeah, I'm afraid I don't buy what he's saying that you can't make changes to it.
Okay, so but then the only thing is to have maybe retirement annuities, and then when that pay out, it can pay into that same living annuity. You don't
Yes,
open a new one. Okay, all right.
you
Thanks.
can do either. You can open a new one or you can add to it. Both of those are viable options, but you just won't be able to do it before the age of 55.
Okay, so you can have more than one living annuity
Yes,
once you reach the golden
yes.
age. Okay, good.
Yes, you absolutely can. And interestingly enough, the reason why people sometimes have more than one is that they follow different drawdown strategies from the two. So from the one, they might be drawing just what they need in terms of their regular monthly income, and they've got a particular investment strategy around that one. And the other one, they might say, you know what, 2.5% annually, that's a different pot. It plays a different role in sort of my overall wealth plan. I don't want to go into the details sort of the why or the how, whatever, but it's certainly possible to do so. The benefit of having it all together is often that the bigger the living annuity, the lower the cost, because there is a sliding cost scale often associated with it. So rather than having, 3 separate living annuities of 3 million rand each, you would be better off having one living annuity of 9 million rand, just as an example.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Cool. All right. So let's then talk about what are our feasting options. It's now time that we start eating from this pot. So the first thing that I want to really sort of share with you is that we have different annuity options available. We're focusing on living annuities here today, but the one that I think people might be more, especially if you're old enough, you're more familiar with this idea of the traditional pension. Now, in let's call it a personal annuity sort of space, this would be called a guaranteed annuity or a life annuity. And this plays very much the same sort of role, and it has the same structure as the traditional pension that you used to get from your company. You work for them the entire life, you retire from them in your pension fund, and thereafter they pay you a regular income for the rest of your life, however long or short that life may be. So a life annuity or a guaranteed annuity is the same principle. What are some of those considerations? So when it comes to annual adjustments, yes, there may be annual adjustments, but it is predefined. At the time of buying or going into this life annuity, you only at that time have the ability to say, do I want my annual adjustments to be inflation linked? Do I want it to be fixed? Do I want it to be variable? Variable could also be market or investment performance related link. Do I want it to be indexed to something? So there are some options available around the annual adjustments, but you only once in your life get the opportunity to decide what those annual adjustments, the structure or the criteria for that annual adjustment would be, and then that's it. You can't change it later on in life. You can also decide at that, again, just at the time of retirement, that you want your spouse, the surviving spouse, to participate and continue to receive a part of your annuity. Because normally, as the name indicates, a life annuity, the life annuity ends when your life ends, unless you actually take out a surviving spouse participation as part of the annuity. Typical rates there, either 75 or 50% of the annuity that you used to receive. You do find that some, because this has to be done by an insurance company, by the way, so some of them might incorporate risk benefits for you, things like life cover or disability or medical cover or whatever. So those could be included in it. In a living annuity, it's just an income. It doesn't have any of these risk benefits. And then the starting value, as we would call it, the annuity rates, really, when you start this out, is very dependent on the prevailing level of interest rates. And what's quite interesting is that when we are in a relatively high interest rate environment, typically you find that starting annual income that you can get is better than when we are in a low interest rate environment. So there's no harm done in getting quotations for a life annuity or whatever. I'm usually not a big fan of them for various reasons, but there are some people for whom it would make sense to actually have a life annuity. The most common would be if you're already quite a bit older, or if you don't have a particularly big pension pot that you've accumulated. Those would be the two best cases sort of to go for a life annuity rather than a living annuity. Because the living annuity is, as the name suggests, something that continues to live and to grow with you. So in this case also, you are really sort of investing, your whole pot remains invested. So the value of that annuity and what you can draw from it grows with your investments, and it remains yours for the rest of your life, and thereafter also your beneficiaries in terms of this. So a very important consideration here for me is also the flexibility. The fact that you can once a year make changes, not just to your drawdown rate and your frequency of that payment, but you have the flexibility also to change the underlying investments. And we're going to talk a little bit about, what sort of investment considerations one should have around living annuities, but you have that flexibility as your lifestyle or your needs changes, so you can respond to it of that. The other thing that's really important is this gives you a better opportunity to manage your tax liabilities. When you go into a life annuity, that pension or that annuity that you're going to get is what it is, and you're going to be paying the tax on it. In a living annuity, you can reduce the income that you get from your living annuity in order to pay less tax if you have a discretionary pot from which you're also going to draw regular income on which you don't pay income tax. So it becomes a really powerful tool for us in managing our tax liabilities during our feasting or our drawdown phase. And this is certainly even more true when you do have additional sources of income. So that's why we are so focused on, in the wealth accumulation phase, that you also focus on your different pots and make sure that you've got assets going into the tax deferred, into the tax exempt, and into the taxable pot. Because ultimately you want to get to this point where you start feasting off this with a maximum flexibility and optionality that you have around managing the income that you draw, but specifically also managing the tax liabilities of that income that you draw. So if I was quickly just to sort of summarize life versus a living annuity. So are you able to get adequate initial income? Now, in the case of a life annuity, you might not be able to get the right amount of initial income because your pot is just not big enough. In a living annuity, because you're allowed to draw 17.5% from it, you're in a much better position to say, I can start with an adequate income. Of course, 17.5% is not going to be sustainable. I'm here really just talking about adequate initial income. Does it offer you inflation protection? Well, a life annuity, yes. If you chose the inflation-linked option, then you are protected in terms of inflation for life. In a living annuity, you're not guaranteed to have the inflation protection. You've got to make sure that your drawdown rate and how the underlying investment is managed actually accounts for the inflation that's around. Will this last for life? Well, a life annuity, as the name suggests, yes, it is guaranteed to pay out for you as long as you live. And if you live longer than the insurance company thought you would, well, kudos for you. They lose and you win. But if you live for a shorter period of time, then they smile and they say, thank you very much, because that money is not yours anymore. They've taken the whole pot that you put together. So living annuity, again, it's not guaranteed that it will last for life. But if you manage your drawdown rate at a sustainable level and your investments are suitably allocated, then you obviously can make this last, not just for your life, but also for those that come after you. What about flexibility? No flexibility in the life annuity. You make that decision on the day that you retire, and thereafter no changes can be made to it, whereas the living annuity gives you lots of flexibility. A really important aspect, this leaving to the beneficiaries. The life annuity literally means you take your hard-earned, accumulated wealth pot and you hand it over to an insurance company. You say, yours. Do with it whatever you want to. All I get is my guarantee of my income for life, but there's nothing left to your beneficiaries when you die. Living annuity, whatever remains after your death, is there for your beneficiaries. And when I talk about switching sides, what I'm meaning here is that once you go into a life annuity, it's like the Hotel California. You can try and check out, but you can never leave. You can't move from a life annuity. You can't switch out of it. You can't even change providers. You have started with a particular insurance company and that's it. You are married for life. The living annuity gives you the option not only that you can change lots of things within the living annuity or change providers, but you could later in life get to a point where you say, you know, maybe now I'm 80 or maybe I'm even 90 now. And you know what, actually, I just want to get that certainty or whatever. And you can then switch to a life annuity. So retaining that optionality that living annuity gives you, for me, is very, very powerful, especially if one is still relatively younger and you have a diverse asset base and potential sources of income. So how am I going to make sure that my money lasts? If this is my problem in a living annuity, it is the biggest risk. It's great opportunities. How am I going to make sure that it lasts? So very importantly, what's one of the first things that you do with Anne? What's your financial freedom number? You've got to know how big the pot needs to be to support you in terms of the income requirement that you have. But the second thing that then comes after that is that once you've achieved that pot and you're now moving into the living annuity environment, you want to ensure that your drawdown rate, you actually cap that at a sustainable level. Now, what's a sustainable level? Well, fortunately, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority has got beautiful tables for us with recommendations around these sort of rates. And those recommended drawdown rates change based on your starting age. And you see the table there in terms of what they recommend and also what they say is a maximum. So what's the difference between them? The recommended rate is one where they say you will have a sustainable income for the rest of your life with a 90% probability. What that also means is that this is not just, what sustainable means is that the size of the asset base will be retained in real terms in order to sustain you, whether you're going to live for 5 years or for 50 years in this living annuity. So the chances that you're going to run out of money if you start at the recommended drawdown rate is a lot less than the 10% probability, as they put it there. The size of the pool might shrink a bit, but you're not going to run out of money. This is also based on sort of average life expectancy, and it assumes that you have a balanced investment portfolio, and we're going to talk a bit about portfolio sort of considerations. What does maximum mean? Maximum means it's not going to be sustainable, and I think what's quite important here is that this is fine for somebody who's not in a position where they either have the need to or the desire to leave a financial legacy to beneficiaries. So if you don't have children, if you don't have dependents, if you don't have anyone that you want to leave money to, you can absolutely draw down more. And yes, it will run down, it will reduce over time. Still not going to run out, it's just going to get less. And here we start monitoring quite closely then, what are your risks sort of requirements? What's your risk tolerance? What can you manage in terms of this? And this is where I think it becomes quite important to make sure that you do speak to and get the support from a good financial advisor that can help you through that. But if you start with the recommended drawdown rates at whatever the age is at which you start, you'll be fine. You'll be fine for life, despite what the market might do through ups and downs. So let's start with that, because you saw the 4% rule. So that 4%, we've often heard about the 4% rule, and you'll see that's the recommended drawdown rate at the age of 55, which is the age at which you're allowed to start drawing down. So what does this 4% rule mean? So it really means that you determine your starting pension or your starting annuity income as 4% of the retirement savings that you've got, whatever that pool is that you've got. What you then do thereafter is you don't stick to the 4% as a calculation every year with your anniversary. You take whatever that starting rand amount was, and every year you adjust it for inflation, irrespective of what the growth in the market was. So yes, if we've had a great year like we've just had now, that rand amount adjusted for inflation is going to be less than 4%. If we've had a bad year like we did in 2020 or like we did in 2022, that rand amount adjusted for inflation is going to be more than 4%. That's fine. That's not a problem that in subsequent years you now start deviating from that 4%, because in the first year that's your sustainable level at which you start, but subsequent to that the drawdown rate effectively just becomes a calculation, a result. It's not the input into your equation that you're doing. And as long as you are able to generate 4% real growth over the longer term, this will ensure the sustainability of that initial capital value. Now, to generate investment growth over a longer term period of 4% real, CPI plus 4%, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's almost, yes, it is easy. The longer term is the important thing. This is not about monitoring it on a month-to-month basis or a year-to-year basis. Didn't get enough. This is a long term, and we know from long-term perspective, this is the sort of very sustainable growth rates that we get from a very well-diversified investment portfolio. So the ideal here is that you start with what you need in terms of, remember, your financial freedom number, your income needs, and so on. And if it's less than 4%, that'll actually be quite cool, because that allows you maybe in future years that you can do an increase annually of slightly higher than the official inflation rate, and maybe rather something that better reflects your personal inflation rate. So if you can start with less than 4, even better so. And so if you're going to start with more than 4%, as I said, it will affect the sustainability of the capital and result in a smaller inheritance for your beneficiaries and dependents, but you know that you're on a reasonably sustainable path. If we're talking 10, 15% starting level, you're in trouble. I would certainly not recommend that. What are the and very importantly then, costs, because when we talk about this drawdown rate, that's just the amount that you're taking from it. Remember that every percent in cost that you pay is also coming out of your capital. So if you are, the other day I saw somebody who was in a living annuity. She was drawing 2.5%. Guess what her cost base was? 3.5%. So I said to you, do realize that the provider is getting more from your annuity than you're getting from your annuity. So, Kerry, back to your question, is it important? It absolutely is important. What are other retirement sort of drawdown strategies? So one would be to say, I'm going to do a fixed rand withdrawal. Now, this is something that can be done in the early days, especially when this is not sort of your only source of income. So somebody would start on a fixed amount. Let's say I'm going to draw 30,000 Rand a month from my annuity, and I'm going to try and keep that amount steady for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever. So that's a way to try and preserve more of your pool that you've accumulated and not live off it, feast off it too easily. The advantages of this, of course, is that you've got a very predictable source of level of income in terms of it, and it allows your residual capital to grow more before you sort of assess again after 3 years or after 5 years or whatever. The disadvantages, of course, of this is that the purchasing power reduces every year. Now, we are certainly nowadays in a much more benign inflation environment than we've been for many, many years. So from that perspective, the reduced purchasing power might not be a train smash, but your personal inflation rate might be quite a bit higher, in which case this is not a great strategy. And if you start with too high a drawdown, just like with any other strategy, you do have the risk that you're going to run out of money. What if we keep to a fixed percentage withdrawal? Because a lot of people, I think, tend to fixate almost on this percentage, whether it's 4% or 2.5% or whatever the case might be. And every year with the anniversary, they just apply that same percentage. So the problem with that is, of course, that your rand value is going to change from year to year based on whatever the capital value is. As you can see, my lovely little graph there, it's all over the place. So yeah, the advantages, it certainly adjusts your income automatically, and you might be very happy when the income adjusts upwards. But after a bad year, when your income adjusts downwards, it's not so great. So that makes it very difficult to plan financially. So I am not a fan of a fixed percentage withdrawal rate year after year after year. And again, as before, if you start too high, the problem is that you risk running out of money. There's also a process called systematic withdrawal. So typically here, people are looking at, and this is not really very applicable in a living annuity environment, because you've got that requirement of sitting somewhere between 2.5% and 17.5%. But the principle of systematic withdrawals is that basically you don't touch your capital at all. You only live off your income, whether it's interest or dividends. And I'm sure you would have come across people that exactly live on this basis. Of course, the problem with this is, we'll come to the problem. So the advantage of this is you can't run out of money because you never use your capital. You only use the income that it generates. Yes, on a real basis, if the capital doesn't grow by inflation, then the purchasing power runs out, but you're not going to run out of money. And when there is good sort of market performance, it does support a higher income. The problem is that you need quite a big pot of money to start with in order to do this, and your income is going to vary from year to year. Every time when there's an interest rate cut in the country, I hear the wailing of all the people who are living off interest income to say, but now my income is reduced. How am I going to make ends meet? Because I'm only earning interest and it's becoming less and less. So again, not an ideal strategy, but I understand why people that do have enough feel that it is okay for them to just live off their interest and off the dividends in particular. Also, because if you're in a fairly high income tax bracket, you don't have to pay tax on capital gains and that sort of thing. So our preferred methodology, the bucket system. So what does the bucket system really mean? The bucket system says we're now going to start looking also at how are we going to split and invest our big underlying asset pool of our living annuities. We're going to have an income bucket, and the income bucket is going to have the first 3 to say 5 years worth of living expenses, and that you keep in very low risk investments, cash, interest bearing, that sort of thing, to ensure that you actually have got your income guaranteed for that period of time. You then have a sort of intermediate bucket where you follow a fairly sort of well-diversified, moderate risk, balanced portfolio, and that can be to cover another 3 to say 5 years of living expenses. Beyond this, bear in mind, we've now covered ourselves for 6 to 10 years from now on. So anything that is left, you now put on a very long-term investment horizon bucket. Here you're going to go for high-risk capital growth strategy, because remember, we're also sitting inside a living annuity, so there's no tax payable on any of this, whether it's the interest or the dividends, or whether it's this great capital growth that you're getting from it. It's completely tax-free, what the growth that you're getting. So you then do review it annually. You look at what is the size of my different buckets at the end of each year. You adjust whatever your living expenses might be, wherever you find yourself at that point in time. And then you replenish your income bucket once a year from your intermediate bucket, and you replenish the intermediate bucket from the growth bucket. And so every year we just waterfall sort of it through time like that. But now not only do we have that appropriate risk profile for each of the buckets, but we also have an appropriate asset allocation and investment strategy for each of these. Now, this is something that we've got to do ourselves, because remember, when you look at your living annuity, you're just going to see one big pot of money. And so you've got to consciously almost demarcate this into these different buckets. Too often I see people going into a living annuity and they've got all the money just in a money market, or they've got all the money just in a long-term bucket. You're not going to see this split out for you like this. So quite important that you sort of do this yourself. So when I do retirement withdrawal planning with clients, this is typically the model that we would be working towards. That ideal starting point is where from your living annuity, you draw down either the 2.5% per annum that you have to draw down, or if your living annuity is relatively smaller and your income needs are relatively modest, you draw an amount that is below the minimum tax threshold. Most of us are probably going to be in a situation where we are still going to have to pay tax, because even 2.5% of the living annuity might be more than the minimum income tax threshold. But that's fine. This is sort of the regular income that you draw from that. You then still have your taxable pot, your tax deferred pot, and your tax-free pot. And you might say to me, why do you now have an RA if you're already in an LA? And I'm going to come to that just now. So the fact that we are in drawdown does not mean that our strategy around having our 3 pots change because of the benefits that it has. Now, within this context of where we draw money from, the withdrawal sequence would be your living annuity, the minimum that you have to do, draw from your taxable pot where you don't pay income tax, it's other taxes that you pay, through your tax deferred. Ultimately, the last pot that you want to draw from is your tax-free account. So the least tax efficient of all of this is, of course, your LA, because you're taxed on on that regular income that you draw, but also your taxable pot, because there you do pay tax on the interest that you earn, you do pay dividend withholding tax, and capital gains above the minimum threshold of 40,000 Rand a year is also taxable. So there is certainly tax implications in terms of this. The most tax efficient is, of course, the tax-free account, because there's no tax during the lifetime of it, no income tax on withdrawals, no tax on dividends, no tax on capital gains, but it does end up in your estate. So a tax-free account is tax exempt until the day that you die, and then it does become part of your estate. But now, how do we now manage the balance between these poor tax efficient vehicles versus the very tax efficient vehicles? Well, what's going to happen is, from the income that we draw from our living annuity and from our taxable investment, we should continue to make contributions to retirement savings for one reason and one reason only, and that is to reduce the ongoing tax that you pay. So this is a way for you to manage your tax liability when you're in drawdown by making new contributions to a new RA that you now have. And then occasionally, every couple of years or whatever, it gets to the point where you say, you know what, this new tax RA that I've built up has now grown sufficiently that it's worthwhile for me to actually move that back into my LA, and I boost my LA pot, my annuity pot once again. And this is a classic rinse and repeat sort of process where you earn income, you've got to pay some taxes on it, you reduce that tax by making contributions to the RA, and you channel that occasionally, certainly not every year, but every couple of years you channel that back into it. So I think I'm probably running out of time, and I always talk too much. So let's quickly talk just about sort of the investment strategy or the asset allocation sort of around, because, okay, that's fine. So now I know about all of these buckets, but how should I be invested in it? Now, the traditional way of thinking, and I've got quite a big aversion to these life cycle funds or these target dated funds, because what these things do is they de-risk you because they think you shouldn't be taking on too much risk. So the classic situation was this one of you getting a real return of 5%, building up to the retirement age, and now you de-risk. And now you go just to a money market fund, just to an income fund where you basically just get a 2% real return if you're lucky, and basically you run out of money sooner than you would otherwise. Whereas if you consider our bucket system, where we know that some of the money, yes, we want to have in the 2% real return bucket, but only some of it. A big part of it is going to sit in our long-term bucket where we still want to grow, where we still want to earn that same 5% real return that we earned in our accumulation phase. What you're doing with that is you're basically just extending the lifetime and the sustainability of this capital pool that you've got. So be very wary of life cycle funds, of target dated funds. And if you're in an occupational pension or provident fund, where they also have this idea that they need to actually de-risk you before whatever their retirement date is, be very careful. De-risking is appropriate if you're going to go to a guaranteed or a life annuity or to a defined benefit pension plan. That's the situation where the amount of money that you've accumulated by retirement gets converted to this future income stream of monthly pension amounts at a single point in time. So the total value that you've got at that point in time is crucial. Do not de-risk if you're going to be going into a living annuity or if you are going to a with-profit pension plan. With-profit pension plan basically allows for the annual adjustments of your pension along with the investment profits that were made. Now, I can tell you, I mentioned to you that I'd, at the age of 55, retired from all of my retirement savings. Guess when that was? March 2020. Do you remember what happened in March 2020? It was COVID. What happened to markets? Oh my goodness, let me see if I can find it here on the floor to try and pick it up. Most people were horrified by the idea that you retire at a time in markets when markets have dropped 20%. Why did it not concern me? Because I went straight into a living annuity where when the market then recovered, I just enjoyed all of that growth and that recovery in my living annuity. If I had de-risked prior to that point, I would not have enjoyed that recovery in it. So also be very careful to be over sort of focused on the current market conditions as you move from pre-retirement to post-retirement. Consider the fact that in the post-retirement, in the living annuity, your time horizon is still exceptionally long, especially for some of the money. So, for example, in our living annuity, we have 7 different risk profile portfolios helping you to really sort of manage all of this. On the extreme left, the protector fund, which is just money market. That's the stuff where my money is going to sit that I'm going to be drawing in this next year or two. Just money market. And as we move through this, you'll see that the proportion of growth assets increases and the proportion of income or defensive assets reduce over time. So the bulk of my money for the long term is going to be sitting in that oyster and that maximizer portfolio where I'm going for maximum long-term capital growth, whilst I still know that in the short term, my near-term income needs are being met with no market risk. So, in conclusion, we did reach that point. I really think that the living annuities offer you flexibility and control when you're in your feasting phase, in your drawdown stage, that you certainly can't get it from life annuities. And it is a very complementary product and investment option alongside a normal taxable account. But you've got to start with enough. That's why Anne teaches you how to calculate your financial freedom number. You've got to manage not just your drawdown rate, but also your investment strategy and do so on a sustainable basis. So your investment strategy really must be fit for purpose. Make sure that the aggregate underlying portfolio fits the drawdown rate and that strategy. And just for you again, Kerry, always keep an eye on the costs. So yes, for me, the ideal situation for myself as well as for clients is that you've got the combination of the tax deferred and the taxable pot, and that you draw your regular income from a combination of these two, because of the differences in how the tax treatment really looks at this. And that really puts us in, I think, the ideal position to be in when we reach that phase in our life where we are now in our feasting phase, where we're living off the assets that we've accumulated.
Nerina, you're frigging fabulous as always. Oh, Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Come, let's stop sharing. I want to see your fabulous face.
I'm here.
Come on back in.
Let's just find the stop share button.
There
There
we
we
go.
go.
You know, I mean, just so comprehensive, so and you know, and this is the key thing, realizing the more we can take responsibility and therefore control and then have the freedom, even though it might feel scary, this is exactly what we're doing. We're putting our big girl panties and big boy panties on and realizing we can't outsource our freedom. We cannot outsource our financial well-being. We can get support, we can get systems. And just thank you for just, again, understanding these tools that we have and that the things that we can control within that. And yes, you know, I'm a big believer, also have investments and assets outside of your retirement pots to really be able to play with this. And you made such an important point around, you know, it's how to get it into our heads, change this narrative of you retire at 65 and then as though life ends, or that you're going to stop being able to even earning income or add value, because that mindset literally comes from almost pre the world wars. I mean, we're talking a long fucking time ago when people maybe went to pasture for 2 or 3 years and then popped their clogs. You know, we got to think differently. For most people, you're going to be living 30, 40 years. And so to slaughter your money and put it into something that can't grow, it's this devastation. And well, this is why Nerina and I are so passionate about this education. We see so many people living in a later stage of their life in very devastating and difficult financial conditions because they've made really disempowered choices around sitting with their money in a money market or doing a fixed annuity because they didn't know there was another option. And as you say, well, heaven forbid, living off interest, and which is a similar thing. But as wealth builders here, we're certainly not going to be that at all. So before this amazing woman goes, you can also find Nerina and her amazing team over at ETFSA, one of our favorite platforms in South Africa for all of your investing needs, but just you're so abundant with your information and your support. And so thank you so much, as always, the amazing Nerina Visser. And thank you to this amazing community for showing up for yourself, for each other. It is such a privilege. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.